Grav saying you've been thinking about this a bit, and Fantasy Strike being so aggressive about paring down move sets is that it's just too much. Ah, yeah, that's true, right? Like Frostfire paring down moves, Fantasy Strike paring down moves. Yeah, I've talked about this a little bit in the past, where I think fighting game design, especially amongst the indies and the approachable, the folks who have chosen to go into more approachable fighting game design, when they did that, they went very, very far in the approachable pare things down direction. And that kind of became the zone of the approachable, the dive kick to Fantasy Strike range. And then it took a few years. And slowly but surely, you saw games add bits of complexity as time went on. And I think we're finally getting to the point where, yeah, the appetite for the hyper stripped down stuff is starting to wane. I still find games like Dive Kick and Fantasy Strike, Tough Love Arena, and Hyper Hitboxing, right? Those are really interesting takes on it, and I enjoy them. But yes, I think that desire for the hyper strip down is starting to wane. And what we're finding is that games are moving further forward, either keeping some of the design paradigms like one-button specials and moving into more complex things elsewhere, like combo structures if you're playing something like Battle for the Grid, or Blade Strangers, for example. And then there are games that go more technical with lateral elements of fighting games, things like mobility. You're seeing a lot of games now these days with a focus on like variable mobility is what I'm calling it, and it's this idea where you have more control over your like aerial movement. Duels of Fortune has a feature like you can jump forward and you can control your positioning in the air. It's like the Mario jump, I guess is one way to call it, right? Where you have this, you push forward and then you can pull back your momentum even though you're in midair. That's a really cool thing. MVCX from FGC Devo is doing a, like they have their super jump, and then you can fast fall if you just hold down after a super jump. And it offers this really cool like bunny hopping mobility thing, as well as combo opportunities and combo extensions. These are games that are relatively simple, all things considered, right? They're much more pared down, and they started introducing more button complexity, more stuff like that, and then this interesting aspect of mobility. So yeah, I think Hypergraph, to your point, that yeah, this is something that, is it too much? Is this stripping down too much? And now developers are asking the much more interesting question of what should be stripped down, right? Okay, we've taken basically everything away. Dive kick, great. Okay, now introduce a bit more, right? Bigger move sets, more exchanges and stuff like that. We got Fantasy Strike. Then introduce a bit more, right? And so it's like, now we're starting to ask not only more what, but how. And so you have games like Dojo Masters, which is an upcoming one from Bye Bye Blue, I believe is their handle. And this is a, once again, fast exchanged, martial arts focused, 2D simplified fighting game. But they're bringing in complexity in various ways with the intricacies of their combat are far more complex than most of your simple fighting games, even though the button inputs might be simpler, or the structure might be simpler, or there only might be one or two exchanges. There's no super hyper extended combos. I think the space of approachable fighters is about to become extremely interesting in the next 3 years. If you want me to prognosticate a little bit, right? If we were going to peer into the orb, ponder our orbs, then I think that it might be one of the things that we're going to be seeing is this expansion. Interesting, Magnet. You think it's a good idea for indies fighters to be very casual because indies are not going to be in major tournaments anyways. Yeah, I guess so. But just because you're not going to be in major tournaments doesn't mean you're not going to be appealing to the competitively minded, right? If you have a hyper competitive player, they might still want that, even though they're not going to play it at EVO, right? But they want their group of 10 or 16 to be the competitive, right? And then there are other approaches, which are like some of the games, some fighting games, and indie games especially, do more of like the popcorn fighting game. The Fight of Animals. These are games that, yeah, they're not intended to be even games that are necessarily represented at hyper-competitive tournaments, maybe in an adjacent capacity. But they're supposed to appeal to the fighting game minded, right? And be able to, you should be able to enjoy them on different levels. That's where I think indies have an opportunity, is to expand into the alternate. I think this is why you see a lot of fighting game adjacent stuff coming out of the indies. You see a lot of fighting game brawlers, fighting game music games, fighting game whatever, right? Like, and you get that in a way that you don't get it from major developers. I think that's kind of one of the things they're doing, right? It's like, yeah, not necessarily... It's important to have both competitive style fighting games and casual style fighting games and every other style of fighting game, right? And I think it's really tough to break outside that, I think, at the high end, where Capcom can't really stray too far from what Capcom does with fighting games, lest you piss off millions of players. Indies can be like, we got 50 who really love it and they're gonna love it, and we got other people who might come in if it's what they want, so we should be experimenting, right? And I think that's a good opportunity. And also, yes, a lot of the indies do. I mean, we talked about some of the indie majors, basically, right? Indie Evo was one of them, Vortex Gallery, Anime-Evo being others. The Quarterly Rapport is another one. I don't think I've seen anything out of them lately, unfortunately. And those games, and they do. And you look at Fraud Crew, the events they put on, Alex Alchemy, right? Dr. Butler, they put on these things, the Fight for the Future events, SOCON, and stuff like that, right? These games will get a lot of players if you provide the venue, right? And even the less hyper-competitive ones will get representation, but the games that are really designed in the mold of we want the like head-to-head, hardcore kind of player, those do get their rep there, right? It's there's a little bit of build it and they will come, right? And a lot of it is that there's not the venue for these games to be presented in that major capacity, right? That capacity as a major event. Is it that there's no demand for it, or is it that it's people haven't built the infrastructure to allow for it? I know, I still think about that too. The time the ArcSys fighting designer chose Merfight as their game of the year for doing interesting things with fighting games. I think that speaks to indies are doing interesting and worthwhile things that are being recognized by developers at all levels, and they're not necessarily being recognized by the fighting game at large yet. You would believe if games like Merfight and Idle Showdown didn't try to introduce obviously worse simple inputs alternative to technical input. Okay, yeah. The way the simplified inputs handled, I think, has traditionally been a very narrow view of that, but once again, there's been an expansion on how developers view those kinds of aspects of fighting games and what they mean for approachability. And Tough Love Arena is my favorite example, I think, of a game that really said, not only can we reduce the number of, like, we can do one button specials, but also we'll significantly reduce the button real estate. And we'll do this portable design philosophy of being able to transfer knowledge from, like, one style of character. There's variants. There's onion and garlic, right? And they have, like, the same normal tool set, but different special move tool sets and slightly different game plans, and right, but they're variations, but it means it's very portable. You can hop between them and say, oh, I can have this different experience or this different style of gameplay without necessarily having to learn all this other stuff. So that's one way to do the approachability thing, and you've seen an expansion on that. Merfight, once again, doing the lenient inputs as well as one-button inputs, with some difference in terms of how much reward you get from one versus the other, right? And it's a space that's worth exploring, and you're starting to see it explored a lot more. Fantasy Strike basically forcing Jamcross to change his Patreon rewards because there was an expensive tier that would let you choose what game he played for a bit, and Fantasy Strike fans had some disposable cash and a lot of zeal, especially in the early days, and they were happy to put their money where their mouth was in terms of how much they loved the game. Yeah, absolutely. I think Fantasy Strike, in terms of community support and community organizing, is a really interesting one to look at. I mean, we were a fairly small community who were very, very passionate and managed to make the right connections at the right event, Frosty Fausting, which gave us a bit of a home in the real world and a platform there, right? I brought it over to Toronto Top Tiers. We made some weekly out of it. That went on for a very long time. And the relatively small community was like, look, we value this enough that we're willing to put a little bit of money, and enough of them were able to put enough money together to make things like prize payouts actually kind of attractive and helpful, to make things sustainable, and support for tournament organizers to be able to allow them to do their thing. And right, and it was actually impressive how much the Fantasy Strike community was able to do with relatively small numbers and a little bit of like financial backing behind it. There are things you should take note of from that game, I think, both in terms of design philosophy and community management from a strictly community perspective as well as from the developer community relations perspective. I think there are a lot of really important lessons to be learned if you look at Fantasy Strike. I need to do a proper Fantasy Strike retrospective. Because let's be honest, friends, the game's dead. Many hearts to all my Valerie players who will no longer get to zip zoom. True, Graf, you are absolutely correct. It does show that you cannot buy tournament numbers with prize pools. The Frosty Fausting numbers did not match the prize payout. Though, I think consistent prize payouts attracted a lot of players. I would speak to that from the local perspective, and I think the prize payout made Fantasy Strike an excellent also game at an event like Frosty Fausting for a lot of players. And you saw folks in top 8 who were not Fantasy Strike players, right? Lost Soul was, what, 4th place? I think they eliminated me, right? So, like, there were... Katana Prime commentating was so good, right? There were some really good things there, and I think the prize pot did its job in a lot of ways. It will not buy entrance, but it will help solidify your position as an also game, which I think is honestly like there's no shame in that. It is so hard to be the hot game, especially in fighting games, that our events depend on multiple games and support for all of them, and that being like a package worthwhile. Honestly, I find it really hard to go to a major tournament for one game. I went to EVO for Marvel vs. Capcom 3. That entire trip was for like 9 matches of Marvel vs. Capcom 3, right? And that was fine for me. That was where I was at with that game, right? And for me, for Fantasy Strike at the first Frosty Fausting, that's also where I was at for that game. But I don't know, man. I look around these days and I'm like, I can't justify just like going 2 provinces over to play Marvel, which I'm like, yeah, that's fun, but that's my also game now, right? And it's like most of my games are also games, right? Like I don't really have a main game. So I need all of these things to really draw me into an event, to be like, this is going to be worth my while. I get to play Fantasy Strike and Dive Kick and, right, some Murph Fight and some this, that, and then the mystery tournament. Like, that's what's going to bring me there. Yeah, Rafekun, the few times you went to a major, you entered 2 to 5 games. That can be a very stressful experience, too. Don't get me wrong. It can mean that you don't really get to enjoy the event outside of your brackets. But it's the right, you got to hit that right balance, right? And for me it's like 3 games. I would love 3 games that I'm going to an event for, like, and they don't necessarily have to be like, right? Like, okay, so in the days, I mean, call me a Street Fighter player, right? So let's presume for a moment that that's what I'm there for. Honestly, even if Street Fighter isn't there, if I do get to play in a mystery tournament, in a cool indie game tournament, and in like a legacy game tournament that I enjoy, maybe some Sailor Moon or something like that, I'm there for it, right? I'm more inclined to go for those 3 and no Street Fighter than I am for Street Fighter, even if Street Fighter is my main game at this point. Yeah, no, showing up to matches, depending on the venue layout, depending on your schedule, it can be really, really tough and actually stressful. So more than 3, I've done 5 events or 5 games at an event a couple times, and literally it was like my entire weekend was sitting down to play a match and running between ballrooms. That was the extent of my weekend, right? So I want a little bit more free time than that, and I'll sacrifice playing a game to do it. But yeah, no, legitimately though, I would love to do a kind of a look back at the life of Fantasy Strike and what it went through, because yeah, lessons worth learning. Success in a social media sphere or in mindshare doesn't necessarily translate to sales. Free-to-play doesn't necessarily translate to a larger player base. The demand for cosmetics is not the same across major franchises and smaller franchises. The desire for hyper-simplified controls is not as huge or impactful as it is. But it also will make a very real material difference for a certain type of player, right? And so one of those lessons is recognize who you're for, right? And don't try to sell someone on something that they don't actually give a shit about. See, I wouldn't go that far, Andrew. I wouldn't say free-to-play in the indie space is suicide, because, I mean, okay, fair enough. You might not consider Brawlhalla indie, and I would accept that. Though, Idle Showdown is an example of how you can do it in the indie space and succeed while being free-to-play. Now, whether that is possible without something like an IP, like some of the VTubers that they have associated with them, I don't know. No, so, right, yeah, Idle Showdown wasn't able to make money, but the point there being, are you able to capitalize on that? And I think they would. I think Idle Showdown is precisely the kind of game that if you were to actually drop money and purchase a license and have it be an officially licensed product and were able to make money off of it, that the opportunity there for things like characters and crossovers and monetization of cosmetics and stuff like that, you can make a free-to-play game that could support a cosmetic store that makes them money. Like, I genuinely believe that is something you'd be able to achieve, especially with that kind of fervent fan, right? If you can get people to want to keep playing the game, you have that fervent fan, you have that strong IP, I think it's possible, right? That is a very, like, look at how many caveats there were in there, right? You're like, if you're a free-to-play game that hits a fervent market, that has a strong IP, and you're able to get access to that IP, and then you do all the fighting game things right, then maybe you have a chance, right? Like, no, that's slim. But just to say that it's suicide, I don't think is necessarily true. Because I think the truth is that success in any game is going to require a lot of those things. Hitting the right market at the right time, at the right price point, with the right bit of innovation, with the right bit of familiarity, right? Like, all those things. It's why there's no fucking magic formula for it, right? Are you able to secure that license? Do you have the money to pay for it? Perhaps doing that and not saying we're going to do, right? We're not going to invest in the long development timeline of doing the bleeding edge graphics and this, that, and the other. You cut back on style, but you have the right IP and you have the right interest. That could be a path. Yeah, according to Sterling, every time they let people play the game at a convention and stuff, they were full to the brim with people, and it looked like the game would be a runaway success. Right? Popularity at events, especially multi-game events, where people derive value out of being able to get as many experiences as possible across as many games as possible. That is pretty quintessentially fighting game community, if you ask me. How much people value you might change depending on the environment. And if the environment is live at an event, that might be different than at home, right? So it might not translate to a sale. Real. You gotta pick your characters. Yo, I know. Onimaru was... There's a lot of love for Oni in the community, right? I think that, yeah, they did really, really well with that character in terms of making them stand out, both as in playstyle and in design, like visual design. And you're saying that, yeah, fast to build, wildly popular. There is something to be said. I think that is probably the biggest thing. I think indie fighting game timescales need to shrink. You're not able to maintain attention from the community for a long enough period of time for you to do an extended development and have it pay off for you. It costs you too much, and you can't sell the game for that much. Your potential sales are proving to be smaller than what they were 5 years ago and what they were 10 years ago. And so if that's a trend that continues, you need to be able to hit your target demo when you have the most of their attention. You need to hit them at the right price point. And if you're not, it's hard to do that when you spent 5 years on a game, right? So this is like, you don't necessarily want to appeal to the long-term. You don't necessarily want it to be a long-term investment for you. Do you want to necessarily be a developer who, after spending 5 to 8 years developing a game and only being able to sell it for $10, and then enough people buy it and play it and want to be competitive with it, and now you spend another 5 years maintaining that game? That might not be practical, right? So you might not even want the competitive tournament style fighting game. Hitting some of the fighting game adjacent markets, I think this is where it hits up, right? All right. Let me boot up some Murfight.